Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Enchanted Astrology with Ariel Smith. Today, we are going to talk about the upcoming lunar eclipse. And as promised, we are also going to take a look at where Saturn and Jupiter are in the sidereal zodiac. So, in the last episode, we talked about Pluto in Capricorn, Neptune in Pisces, and Uranus in Taurus, and how some of those historical themes that were associated with those transits seem to be showing up again today. And so now we're going to add Saturn in Pisces and Jupiter in Cancer to that picture. Okay, so let's start with Jupiter in Cancer. So Jupiter moved into Cancer on November 5th, 2025, and will move out of the sign November 7th of 2026. However, Jupiter will retrograde back into Cancer again on January 16th, 2027, and he will stay there until he reaches 21 degrees, where he will then station direct and make his final journey through Cancer, eventually leaving on June 30th, 2027. So what do we tend to see with Jupiter in Cancer? Well, Cancer brings up themes around home, family, food, water, protection, belonging, and the needs of groups of people. And Jupiter expands whatever it touches. So this doesn't necessarily mean prosperity and abundance in a straightforward way, because Jupiter is, yes, exalted in the sign of Cancer, but it can actually amplify the need for those Cancer themes. Jupiter can operate very well in the sign of Cancer, and we've seen massive earthquakes and natural disasters that are displacing thousands of people, and this is bringing up some Cancerian questions around things like provision, protection, migration, destruction of homes. Where can people actually go? So we're seeing these themes of large populations that need protection. They need food, water, and shelter, which Cancer is a sign that is very much about providing that sense of safety, security. And Jupiter, because he operates so well in Cancer and is connected with expansion, large groups of people, and he's also associated with help arriving when it's needed. That is his benefic nature, that luck that we call it, right? Or somebody or someone showing up to provide help. And historically, when Jupiter is moving through Cancer, we see an increase, an amplification of these Cancerian themes, especially around caring for and supporting large populations of people. Okay, then we have Saturn in Pisces. Now, Saturn entered Pisces on April 5th of 2025, and he will remain in Pisces until June 12th of 2027. And during his retrograde journey, he will re-enter Pisces on October 8th, 2027, and complete his transit through Pisces for the final time on March 2nd of 2028. So this is the time frame that we are essentially looking at. Now, Saturn in Pisces is interesting because very opposite forces happening. We have Saturn, which wants structure, it wants boundaries, limits, and containment, and Pisces dissolves boundaries, right? So we're dealing with something that is essentially very difficult to contain or put clear limits around. And one example of this we are seeing currently is the Ebola outbreak in the DRC. We are seeing an experience where containment is very, very difficult. We can also look at AI as another example of this, because AI is a technology that is rapidly developing, and it's becoming very difficult to establish boundaries around, or difficult to even determine how we use it, how we regulate it, what do we do with it. So this is part of the larger experience that we see with Saturn in Pisces that deals very heavily with themes of containment and things that are difficult to control or draw boundaries around. And during these transits with Saturn and Pisces, we also start to discover that the systems we currently have in place, which are represented by Saturn, are no longer adequate for the current world. Okay, and that creates like a pressure point, because that inadequacy is very much felt, and a frustration point. And eventually, if the existing structure can't contain or support what it needs to, then something has to change. And that's when we can then see things like movements and revolutions, which also tend to coincide with Saturn and Pisces. Disillusion, eventually structures collapsing that are no longer capable of supporting the future. Okay, so the old structure has become inadequate. Something new has to come about, but before that can happen, there does need to be a dissolving or a letting go of what previously was. So now, when we put all of these planets together, we get a pretty interesting picture, because we have Pluto in Capricorn, which is actively restructuring our worlds. We've talked about how Pluto in Capricorn has historically, coincided with major changes in the foundation of our world, like political or economic structures, things like who has authority, these hierarchies. So we saw this dismantling and this restructuring of the foundation of the world during the Protestant Reformation. We saw it again during the American, French, and Haitian revolutions. And these periods were about questioning who has authority, who gets to hold the power, who gets to make decisions for themselves, and who has to do what they're told, essentially. So this is really on point for Pluto and Capricorn, because Capricorn's a very sovereign sign. Okay, it is highly self-directed. It doesn't need somebody to tell it what to do, and it doesn't want somebody to tell it what to do. So Pluto in Capricorn is looking at where the power currently isn't resting with the individual. Where is there this power imbalance where somebody else is maybe making the decisions for you, or where the systems are deciding for you what you are and aren't allowed to do, what you are and aren't allowed to believe, and basically mediating your experience of how you're supposed to live. And so Pluto comes along and dismantles those structures that uphold that framework. And because Capricorn is all about taking responsibility for creating your own worlds and your own experience. So again, historically, when the church decided what was best for everyone, or when these monarchs and these colonial powers decided and held authority over everyone in their lives, there was a very strong power over dynamic where the people at the bottom didn't get the opportunity to decide for themselves. They were born into a world that was already determined of what they did and didn't get to do, believe, or experience in their material reality. And Capricorn doesn't really work that way. It wants that self-direction. It wants to direct itself. So when Pluto moves through Capricorn, we see these structures of authority being challenged, and the restructuring resulting in more sovereignty on the individual. Okay, then we have Neptune in Pisces, and Neptune is dissolving the boundary between our physical and our spiritual worlds. We see during these periods the physical reality, what is seen and what is unseen, start to become more and more enmeshed in each other. There's not a very clear boundary anymore, where there used to be a very clear boundary between what was physical or what was real, what was reality, and what was maybe fantasy or what was purely spiritual or faith. And now there is this blurring happening of this boundary between the two. And that can be a very confusing experience because, you know, that boundary isn't clear anymore. And we start to see during these periods more investigating into things that previously were just considered completely fantasy, outside of the physical world, not reality, or purely spiritual. You would never get to experience it in the physical. All of these topics start to get seriously investigated. And as a result, we see spirituality, consciousness, mediumship start to become front and center topics in our experience. And bring about these questions of what actually exists beyond us, what we can physically see, what we can't see, the seen and the unseen. And these otherworldly experiences are taken seriously as needing to be addressed more in our physical reality. So we saw this during the Salem witch trials. We're seeing it again with things like disclosure. And we're also seeing science exploring these ideas around how we're all connected and what consciousness is in new ways, and those findings, right, are challenging what we previously thought was reality. So Neptune in Pisces is really blurring those lines between what we consider physical reality and what we consider to be the unseen. Okay, then we have Uranus in Taurus, and Uranus is very disruptive. And Taurus is our, physical and material world. So things like money and property, resources, food and supply chains, and basically all of these things that give us our sense of stability and security, which is something Taurus is all about, how we gain our sense of stability and security. They can all get very disrupted. So we historically see major economic changes, supply chain disruptions, and how we think about property and ownership changing, reestablishing what we're actually putting value to or assigning as valuable. So Uranus and Taurus really tends to shake up whatever we thought was secure and stable. So again, that is things like how we relate to money, ownership, property, in our material world, and how we gain a sense of security from it. And then again, we have Saturn in Pisces, trying to create structure around something that is rapidly dissolving. We are seeing in real time systems that are becoming obsolete. They are becoming inadequate. They cannot contain or support what is needed. And when they can't adapt, they start to break down. So again, we see this through things that we know and feel are becoming increasingly difficult to contain or to regulate, and how that breakdown of those systems is essentially creating the space for something new. And then finally, again, this Jupiter in Cancer, which is amplifying themes around home, security, food, water, protection, and this emphasis on vulnerable populations. And again, we are seeing geological activity in the form of earthquakes, volcanoes, these wildfires. We are seeing floods and also droughts and hurricanes, and all of these events that are displacing large and large numbers of people. And so it's creating this very Cancerian focus of how do we feed them? How do we shelter these people? How do we protect them? Where can we give them a home as their homes are being, destroyed? They're being displaced. And because Jupiter is also associated with help arriving when you need it, we can also see this connection with humanitarian efforts that are stepping in during these disasters, and giving aid, right? Help when you need it to these mass vulnerable populations. So when we put all of these planets together, we seem to be looking at some very changeable times. Change is a very strong indicator here. Change that is radical, that is foundational. And so this can bring us to the chart for our lunar eclipse. So this is the chart for the lunar eclipse that will be happening in Sidereal Astrology at 9 degrees of Aquarius on August 27th at 10:18 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And of course, we know eclipses can indicate major endings and beginnings. So here we have the sun at 9 degrees of Leo conjunct the south node at 4 degrees of Leo. And we also have Mercury right alongside the sun here at 10 degrees of Leo. So right away, we are looking at an ending or a movement away from an old identity or an old way of maybe thinking about ourselves, because Leo relates to the identity and to the self, and Mercury relates to the mind, to our thoughts and our narratives. Mercury is our point of view of the world, how we metabolize the world, how we take it in and process it. And Mercury in Leo can become pretty attached to its narrative. So it's not necessarily this detached perspective of, I think this, but I could be wrong. Its identity is linked with its perspective. So it's more like, I think this, and therefore I am this. Because the way I think is who I am. And so when somebody or something challenges that narrative, it can actually feel like they're challenging the identity with a Mercury in Leo. And so I think this is kind of a theme that we are collectively moving through, because of course we've been given stories, right, about who we are. We've been given these narratives about ourselves, about our history and our world, what is and isn't possible. And we have, grown up identified with those stories and those narratives. And essentially, that has built our world. We've created a world that is based on those narratives. And they're actually holding up the foundation of our reality. And so when the Sun and Mercury in Leo are conjunct the South Node, there is a movement away from that old story about who we are, who we think we are. And that is designed so that we can build a future on a much different foundation. And when we look at all these other planets working together here to dismantle, restructure, and dissolve the old systems, this really feels like a time where we're being asked to create something new. Because we see in this chart, Pluto at 8 degrees of Capricorn. We see Neptune at 8 degrees of Pisces in sextile to that Pluto. We see Uranus at 10 degrees of Taurus sextile to that Neptune, trine that Pluto. These are harmonious aspects operating in the background. We see Saturn in trine with Jupiter. So these are harmonious aspects operating in the background that are supporting this this eclipse. And where we are now in terms of restructuring the world, dissolving the old systems, and creating space for something new. And now when we look specifically at the full moon in Aquarius, Aquarius is a very future-oriented sign. It is very much concerned with what comes next. And the moon tends to materialize or manifest things. So we have the moon in Aquarius essentially building the future, but this eclipse is also squaring Uranus and Taurus. So we have this difficult aspect here with this square, this fixed T-square here with the moon and the north node in Aquarius, the sun, Mercury, and the south node in Leo squaring Uranus and Taurus. And squares create a friction point. They create a type of a pressure that tends to force some type of action or force some type of movement. And this opposition here between the sun and the moon, there can be a reluctance to move forward, right? A reluctance to move out of this South Node Leo space and experience, because it's almost like we feel and we know very much that the old way isn't working anymore. Okay, we know that there is change that needs to happen. We can feel that, but we're still holding on to something from the past, or we're still operating within the structures that are inadequate, that are dissolving. They're, they're no longer functional anymore, but we're still holding on. We're still trying to preserve them in some way. There's a reluctancy here. And so Uranus can create a sudden disruption in the physical reality in Taurus that forces essentially this growth point forward. So it's where eventually you don't have a choice anymore. Something changes, something happens, and that forces movement forward. Okay, and so the square to the north node and the moon in Aquarius is the evolution happening through pressure, where we're not necessarily gracefully deciding to embody the future. Sometimes this just forces us into the future. It forces us to adapt, and that's how it comes about. Okay. And so again, with Mercury involved here, this could show up through information. It could be suddenly receiving new information that changes either the direction or maybe the pace that you're going. It could be a new perspective. Maybe, it's something you see in your newsfeed, or maybe it's a conversation that you have with somebody, something that happens, an unexpected change basically in the material world that forces you to now think differently. Okay, something disrupts, it comes along and it disrupts what you thought was stable or certain. And this will give you a new perspective. Okay, and this is also what happens to these obsolete existing systems that don't want to change. Eventually, they're forced to. Okay, so for your own chart for this eclipse, you'll want to look at where you have Leo and Aquarius by house placement, because that is the axis that is being activated during this eclipse. And especially if you have planets or points between roughly about 1 to 12 degrees, I would say, of Leo or Aquarius, this eclipse is likely to feel much more personal for you. So we see a theme here of the old story, a new perspective, some type of unexpected disruption that results in a change in the way that we understand ourselves and the world around us, and forces that movement forward. And that is what essentially the astrology is pointed to. Now, as I mentioned previously, we are testing out the sidereal system for these delineations. So let's see how it resonates. So thank you so much for joining me today. I wish you a very enlightening week ahead, and I will be back with more updates soon.